Hi, and welcome to this installation of the Regional Director's Grok Talk. My name is Jackie Goldstein. I'm a Microsoft Regional Director and MVP, and what I'll be talking about in the next 10 minutes is rapid Winforms design and data binding. What I want to show you in 10 minutes is how quickly you can design data entry forms using the new tools and technologies in Microsoft Visual Studio 2005. We're going to go straight into Visual Studio 2005 and start off with a demo. I have a blank form, and I want to now go ahead and make it a data entry form. We have a new data sources window. If it doesn't show up here, you can get to it from data show data sources. And I want to add a new data source. You'll notice in this dialog that's about to come up that I have several choices for a data source. The idea is that no matter where my data comes from, be it a database, a web service, or a business object that I've written myself, once I've done that, I can go ahead and have the same data binding features regardless of where that data came from. We're going to go ahead and use a database as our data source. The application is going to get its data from a database with a new connection. I'll specify where the database is. And for the purpose of this demonstration, we'll use the Northwind database. So I'm going to go ahead and select that database. Make sure the connection's working. We'll test the connection. It's working hard, but it'll be here soon. So far, so good. So we have a connection, familiar dialog, and now we can move on in the data source configuration wizard. The next thing I do is get this dialog asking me whether I want to have a copy of this database included in my project. The reason for that is I pointed my data connection to a database file that was way off someplace, maybe on my C drive or some other drive, and it's saying, hey, you can use that where it is, or you can bring that into your project and have that part of your project, make it easier to deploy. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes to that. So it's now going to make a copy of that MDF database file and include that as part of my project. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and continue through the data source configuration wizard and specify what tables, views, or other information I want to include in my data set. So it's going to store the connection string, and now it's going to query the database. It's going to check the schema so it knows what tables and views, other database objects there are, and offer me those choices. So I'm just going to go into the tables, and I will choose customers, employees, order details, and orders. And it's going to go ahead now and generate a typed data set based on those tables, generate the related classes that it needs behind the scenes to give me easy access to the database. Once it does that, I'll be able to see those tables and items in the data sources window and decide to move forward and using them as necessary in my application. Whenever I want to do data-related activity within my application to design forms or other reports, let's say, I'll be able to take the items from the data sources window and drag them onto the appropriate places in my application, be it a Winforms, the form designer, or report designer, etc. So what you see here now, these are the tables that I've defined, and if I open them up, we can see that I can see each of the columns in those tables. Now, next to each column and next to each table is an icon which is called the drop type. That's the control that will be used when I drag these items from the data source window onto my Winforms designer. So I want to start with the orders table. I want to get the details view instead of the grid view. I want to go ahead, change the order number, the ID, to a label. That doesn't need to be a text box. And I'm going to change the customer ID as well to be a combo box, and the employee ID also to be a combo box. Now that I've set up the drop types that I want, I'm going to drag the entire table so I get all the columns onto my Winform. When I do that, the designer will now go to work. It'll create some smart labels for every control that I've drawn over. It'll decide on the appropriate label and actually uses regular expressions to figure out what that label text should be. It's not going to get it 100% all the time, but it's really a very good guess of what it should be. So it didn't put in blanks and separated the words, which is very nice. Down here on the component tray, we have several components. First of all, we have the Northwind type data set on this end. On this end, we have the orders binding navigator. And that's simply the component that gives us this navigator toolbar up on top. That's not necessary to run the form. That's just a GUI thing. So if we want it, we can keep it. If not, we go ahead and delete it. The other two things we have down here are the orders table adapter, which is a new wrapper for the data adapter from the ADO.NET objects. What it does gives us much easier access to those data objects. It lets us configure multiple commands for a single data adapter. The final component down here is a binding source. Binding source is a new element that stands in between our data source and our actual controls. So each of our controls will be bound to our binding source, and then our binding source will be bound to our actual data source, which means I can go ahead and change my data source, let's say from a database to an object or to a web service, without affecting the controls. All the binding that I've set up for my GUI controls remain in place. Let's do a little bit of redesign on the form, and then we'll go ahead and see if it actually works. We're going to grab these controls, move them over here. We'll just leave them here for now. And let's go ahead and run the application, see if we've made some progress. So as the application comes up, we'll see that the controls are there, and actually it's gone out to the database and started bringing in data. And the navigation bar that we had up on top will be fully functional. So here's our form. We can see we could step through the different rows in our database, skip to the end, etc. We could also go ahead and add a new row by clicking this button, or we can back out of that and say, no, that's not what I want to do. I could delete a row, and I can go ahead and save this. Visual Studio has actually generated code behind the form to make the call to save this data to the database. But that's not interesting enough. Let's go a little bit further. Let's go ahead and now display at the same time a related table. We're going to move these controls up, make some room. And this time I'm just going to simply take the order details table as is and drag it onto here so we see it as in the grid view. I'm just going to scroll this out. The fact, okay, I'm going to actually back out of that. I actually took the wrong order details table. If I take it from here, it'll be an independent table. I want to back out of that. And take the order details I'm going to go ahead and take this order details table, which is underneath the orders table, thereby preserving the relationship between the two tables, so that when I scroll through the master table, the corresponding records in the details table will be what show up. So we're going to go ahead and run that. When the application runs now, we'll see our form. And as I use the navigation bar on top of that form, as soon as it appears, we'll see that down below, the records in the grid change as I scroll through the different records in the orders table. So the order details is linked automatically to the order records up on top. The last thing it's missing now is if I look at the customer ID and the employee ID, I see there's no list box. And I don't really know who employee ID 3 is. So I want to go ahead and have those list boxes take advantage of the lookup information available in the tables. And here I get to use the other method of building Winforms. Instead of dragging from the data source window onto the form, I want to go ahead and take an existing control and hook it up with data from the data source window. So I'm going to go ahead and take the customers table and drag the customers table onto the customer ID list box. And we'll go ahead and set up the binding for that. We can look at the smart tag and see exactly what it's done. If it guessed the wrong fields, we can go ahead and correct them. Usually it does a good job of guessing. And we're going to do the same thing for the employees table. We're going to come back to the data source window, drag the employees table onto the employee list box. It's going to do its work, and we're going to run the application one last time. Now when the application runs, we'll have the same functionality we had before as I scroll through the records. But in addition, my customer list box and my employee list box will now be fully populated with the correct items. And in the background, I'll be using the values to update the related records. But visually, in the GUI, we'll see the actual list items and the names. So what we've seen in this presentation is how the new tools and technologies in Visual Studio 2005 allow us to very quickly and easily build data entry forms that include full scrolling, update, delete, all the functionality we want with a minimum of work and great productivity. Thank you.
All right.